The economics of empire are rarely sustainable. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Yet Nazi Germany planned an economic reorganization of Europe so comprehensive that it would have reshaped the continent's industrial structure, agricultural production, labor systems, and financial relationships for generations. These weren't vague aspirations. They were detailed economic programs, some already implemented during the war, that reveal what a German-dominated European economy would have looked like. Understanding the economic consequences of a German victory requires examining actual Nazi economic policies in occupied territories during the war, the planning documents that outlined future economic organization, and the fundamental principles that drove Nazi economic thinking. What emerges is a system designed to extract maximum benefit for Germany while reducing the rest of Europe to economic subordination. The foundation: Grossraumwirtschaft. Nazi economic planners operated under the concept of Grossraumwirtschaft, or large area economy. This wasn't simply traditional imperialism. It was a comprehensive economic doctrine that envisioned Europe as an integrated economic space organized hierarchically with Germany at the center. The concept originated in the 1930s as Nazi economists sought to justify and plan for German expansion. The basic premise held that modern industrial economies required large, integrated economic spaces to function efficiently. Small national economies with protective barriers were obsolete. Europe needed to be organized as a single economic unit under unified direction. The critical detail was who would provide that unified direction. Nazi planners had no doubt it would be Germany. The Grossraumwirtschaft concept provided intellectual cover for what was essentially a plan for German economic domination dressed in the language of economic rationalization and efficiency. During the war, elements of Grossraumwirtschaft were implemented in occupied territories. Germany established currency controls, directed trade flows, seized industrial output, and reorganized production to serve German needs. Under a victory scenario, these temporary wartime measures would have been formalized into a permanent economic structure. The four-year plan organization, led by Hermann Göring, was the primary agency implementing economic exploitation during the war. This organization's wartime activities provide a template for understanding what peacetime economic organization under German domination would have entailed: resource extraction and agricultural exploitation. The most immediate economic consequence of German victory would have been systematic extraction of resources and agricultural products from occupied territories to Germany. This wasn't theoretical. It was already happening during the war on a massive scale. Agricultural production throughout occupied Europe was redirected to feed Germany. France, with its productive agricultural sector, was required to deliver enormous quantities of grain, meat, dairy products, and wine to Germany. Poland's agricultural output was seized. Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, was designated in Nazi planning as a primary source of grain for the Reich. The wartime requisition system would have become permanent. Occupied territories would be required to deliver fixed quotas of agricultural products to Germany at artificially low prices set by German authorities. This wasn't trade. It was tribute extracted through administrative fiat backed by military force. The consequences for occupied populations would have been severe. During the war, German requisitions created food shortages throughout occupied Europe. Ration systems were implemented, with Germans receiving priority allocations and occupied populations getting whatever remained. In some territories, particularly in the East, deliberate starvation policies were implemented as part of population reduction programs. Under a victory scenario, these policies would have continued indefinitely. Germany would eat first and eat well. Occupied populations would subsist on whatever was left after German needs were satisfied. Chronic malnutrition would have been standard in much of occupied Europe, particularly in Eastern territories where Nazi racial ideology deemed the population expendable. Raw material extraction would follow similar patterns. Coal from Poland and Silesia would fuel German industry. Iron ore from France and Sweden would feed German steel mills. Oil from Romania and the Caucasus would power German vehicles and aircraft. Timber from occupied Soviet territories would supply German construction. The extraction rates would be determined by German needs, not by sustainable production levels in occupied territories. If mines were exhausted or forests stripped, that was a problem for the occupied populations, not for German planners. The concept of sustainable resource management didn't apply when the resources belonged to conquered peoples deemed inferior. Manufacturing of raw materials into finished goods would be controlled. Nazi planners intended to keep heavy industry concentrated in Germany and trusted satellite regions. Occupied territories would provide raw materials and perform low-value manufacturing under German supervision, but wouldn't be permitted to develop independent industrial capacity that could support future resistance. Industrial reorganization and de-industrialization. Nazi economic planning envisioned a radical reorganization of European industry along hierarchical lines. Germany would be the industrial core, producing high-value manufactured goods, advanced machinery, and military equipment. Occupied territories would be assigned specific roles in this industrial hierarchy based on their perceived value and reliability. Western European territories with advanced industrial sectors, particularly France and Belgium, presented both opportunity and threat to German planners. On one hand, their industrial capacity could be exploited to benefit Germany. On the other hand, independent industrial power could support future resistance. The solution was selective de-industrialization. Industries that competed with German production would be shut down or relocated to Germany. Industries that complemented German production or provided inputs for German manufacturing would be maintained under German supervision. The goal was to make occupied territories industrially dependent on Germany, while eliminating their capacity for independent industrial development. France's aircraft industry provides a clear example. During the war, French aircraft factories were either shut down or converted to produce components for German aircraft. French automotive production was similarly subordinated, producing trucks and vehicles for German use under German specifications. Under a victory scenario, this relationship would have been formalized. France would have automotive industry, but it would be an appendage of German industry, not an independent sector. Eastern European territories would face more severe deindustrialization. Nazi racial ideology held that Slavic populations didn't need or deserve advanced industry. Existing industrial facilities in Poland and occupied Soviet territories would be dismantled and shipped to Germany, or maintained only if they served German needs directly. The planned economic fate of Soviet industrial centers reveals this policy clearly. Leningrad, a major industrial city, was to be completely destroyed. Its population would be killed or expelled, its factories dismantled. Moscow would be flooded, erasing not just a political capital but an industrial center. Other Soviet cities would be reduced to administrative outposts serving German resource extraction operations. This wasn't economic rationality. It was ideologically driven destruction that would have eliminated enormous industrial capacity simply because it existed in territories designated for German colonization. The economic irrationality of Nazi policies often conflicted with their stated goal of creating an efficient European economy, but ideology consistently won these conflicts. The deindustrialization policies would have created permanent economic dependency. Occupied territories would need to import manufactured goods from Germany, creating perpetual trade imbalances that Germany could exploit. Without independent industrial sectors, occupied populations would lack the economic foundation necessary for eventual resistance or independence movements. The labor system. From exploitation to slavery. The Nazi economic order required enormous quantities of labor, and it planned to acquire this labor through the most brutal forms of exploitation, up to and including outright slavery. The wartime forced labor system provides a clear preview of what permanent labor arrangements would have looked like. By 1944, Germany had imported approximately 7.5 million foreign workers. Some came voluntarily, lured by promises of wages and working conditions. Most came through coercion, rounded up in occupied territories and transported to Germany under guard. Their working conditions ranged from harsh to lethal, depending on their perceived racial category and the specific labor assignment. Eastern European and Soviet workers faced the worst conditions. Nazi racial ideology designated them as untermenschen, subhumans whose lives had minimal value. These workers received starvation rations, were housed in barracks resembling prison camps, and were worked to the point of death in many cases. Worker mortality rates for Eastern laborers in German armaments factories reached 20 to 30% annually in some facilities. Under a victory scenario, this labor exploitation would have been formalized into a permanent caste system. The SS planned to establish labor camps throughout Eastern Europe where Slavic populations would be held as agricultural and construction workers. These wouldn't be temporary wartime expedients. They would be permanent institutions providing Germany with an unlimited supply of expendable labor. The economic logic was straightforward from a Nazi perspective. Why pay German workers adequate wages when you could coerce foreign workers for minimal cost? The labor system would drive down wages across Europe, as businesses could threaten to replace workers with forced labor from the East. This would increase profits for German industrialists while reducing the standard of living for everyone except the German elite. German workers would benefit relative to occupied populations, receiving higher wages and better conditions. But even they would face downward wage pressure from the vast pool of coerced labor. The only true beneficiaries would be German industrial magnates and the state apparatus that controlled labor allocation. The agricultural sector would rely heavily on coerced labor. Large estates in eastern territories would be worked by local populations reduced to serfdom. German settlers would supervise, but the actual labor would be performed by Slavic workers with no rights and minimal compensation. This was essentially a return to feudal labor arrangements, justified by Nazi racial ideology. Construction projects would be powered by forced labor on a massive scale. The planned reconstruction of bombed German cities, the construction of monumental Nazi architecture, and the building of infrastructure in occupied territories would all utilize coerced workers. Mortality rates would be high, but from a Nazi perspective, this was acceptable. The eastern territories contained vast populations that could be worked to death and replaced. Currency, banking, and financial control. Financial control was essential to the Nazi economic order. Germany planned to dominate European financial systems through currency manipulation, banking control, and extraction of financial assets. During the war, Germany imposed occupation currencies in conquered territories and set exchange rates that dramatically overvalued the Reichsmark. This allowed Germany to purchase goods and services in occupied territories at artificially low real costs. The occupied territories essentially financed their own exploitation through forced acceptance of overvalued German currency. Under a victory scenario, the Reichsmark would become Europe's de facto reserve currency. All other European currencies would be pegged to the Reichsmark at rates favorable to Germany. The Reichsbank would function as Europe's central bank, controlling monetary policy across the continent. This financial architecture would provide Germany with enormous advantages. Germany could export inflation to occupied territories by printing Reichsmarks and using them to purchase real goods and services. Occupied territories would be forced to accept these increasingly worthless Reichsmarks at fixed exchange rates, bearing the cost of German inflation. Capital controls would prevent wealth flight from Germany to occupied territories or from occupied territories to safe havens outside German control. All significant financial transactions would require German approval. This would give Germany power to monitor and control economic activity throughout Europe. Banking systems in occupied territories would be subordinated to German oversight. Major banks would be required to have German directors or advisors who could monitor their operations and ensure compliance with German economic policies. Jewish-owned banks had already been seized during the war through Aryanization programs. Under a victory scenario, any banks that resisted German control would face similar seizure. Stock markets in occupied territories would be manipulated to benefit German investors. Valuable companies would be forced to sell shares at depressed prices to German buyers. This would transfer ownership of European industry to German hands without requiring Germany to pay fair value. The looting of gold reserves and financial assets that occurred during the war would be formalized into a permanent system. Occupied territories would be required to hold their reserves in Reichsmarks rather than gold, making them dependent on German monetary policy. Gold and hard currency reserves would be confiscated and held in Germany. Taxation systems would be manipulated to extract wealth from occupied territories. In addition to direct requisitions of goods and resources, occupied territories would be required to pay occupation costs that would amount to tribute payments thinly disguised as administrative fees. These payments would transfer enormous wealth from occupied territories to Germany year after year. Trade patterns and economic dependencies. Nazi economic planners intended to restructure European trade patterns to create permanent dependencies that would bind occupied territories to Germany economically, even if political control ever weakened. The principle was simple. Occupied territories would export raw materials and agricultural products to Germany and import manufactured goods from Germany. This classic colonial trade pattern would prevent occupied territories from developing balanced economies capable of independence. Trade with nations outside German control would be restricted or prohibited entirely. Occupied territories wouldn't be permitted to develop trade relationships that could provide alternatives to German dominance. All significant trade would flow through Germany, giving German authorities power to monitor and control economic relationships throughout Europe. Belgium provides a clear example of how this system would operate. Belgium's industrial sector, particularly its steel and chemical industries, would be maintained because they complemented German production. Belgian steel would be exported to Germany for further processing into manufactured goods. Belgium would then import these finished products from Germany, creating a cycle of dependency. France's luxury goods industries might be preserved because they didn't threaten German industrial dominance and could generate export earnings that would ultimately flow to Germany through the controlled trade system. French wines, perfumes, and fashion would be exported to Germany and German-approved markets, with the proceeds subject to German financial controls. Eastern European territories would be relegated to supplying primary products. Ukraine would export grain. Romania would export oil. Poland would export coal. None would be permitted to develop processing industries that could add value to these raw materials. The value addition would occur in Germany, ensuring that the economic benefits of European production accrued primarily to Germany. This trade structure would create unemployment and poverty in occupied territories. Without balanced economies that could employ their populations productively, occupied territories would face chronic unemployment. This served Nazi goals by making populations desperate and dependent, less capable of organizing resistance. The prohibition on industrialization would be enforced through multiple mechanisms. German authorities would deny access to machinery and technology needed for industrial development. Capital would be unavailable for industrial investment in occupied territories. Educated personnel capable of managing industrial operations would be recruited to Germany or prevented from working in their home countries. Living standards and economic stratification. The economic consequences for ordinary people would vary dramatically based on their position in the Nazi racial and political hierarchy. Germans would live well, at least initially. Everyone else would face declining living standards ranging from austerity to destitution. German living standards would be maintained through extraction from occupied territories. Food, consumer goods, and luxuries would flow to Germany from across occupied Europe. German workers would have access to products unavailable to occupied populations. Housing would be comfortable by European standards. This material comfort would be purchased at the expense of occupied populations. However, even German living standards would face long-term challenges. The economic inefficiencies of the Nazi system would eventually create shortages and reduce overall production. The absence of market mechanisms and the distortions created by forced labor and resource extraction would lower productivity across the European economy. Germans would be relatively better off than occupied populations, but absolutely worse off than they would have been in a functioning market economy. Western European populations in territories like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands would face significant declines in living standards but not complete immiseration. They would have access to basic necessities, though at reduced levels compared to pre-war standards. Consumer goods would be scarce and expensive. Housing would be adequate but crowded. Education and healthcare would be maintained at basic levels. These populations would live under permanent austerity. Their agricultural and industrial output would be extracted to benefit Germany, leaving minimal surplus for their own consumption. Wages would be suppressed by competition from forced labor. Opportunities for economic advancement would be limited by German control over education and career paths. Eastern European and Soviet populations would face catastrophic declines in living standards. Nazi plans called for reducing these populations through starvation, disease, and overwork. Rations would be set at subsistence level or below. Housing would be minimal, often barrack-style accommodations. Healthcare would be unavailable except for workers deemed particularly valuable. Education beyond basic literacy would be prohibited. Life expectancy in Eastern territories under permanent Nazi occupation would have declined dramatically. Infant mortality would spike due to malnutrition and lack of medical care. Working-age adults would be worked to exhaustion and death. The elderly would receive no support and would die quickly. The demographic consequences would be devastating. Social mobility would be eliminated for occupied populations. Economic and social position would be determined by birth and racial classification. No amount of hard work or talent would allow individuals from occupied territories to rise above the position assigned to them by Nazi racial hierarchy. The economic order would be simultaneously an enforced caste system. Women in occupied territories would face particularly harsh economic conditions. They would be exploited as both workers and as targets of population policies. Reproductive labor would be coerced, with women from Eastern territories potentially subject to forced sterilization programs, while women deemed racially valuable might be pressured to bear children for adoption by German families. Infrastructure and economic development. Infrastructure investment in occupied territories would be minimal and focused entirely on extraction rather than development. Roads, railways, and ports would be maintained or built only insofar as they facilitated movement of resources to Germany or German military forces through occupied territories. Occupied territories would experience infrastructure decay. Existing infrastructure would be exploited without maintenance or replacement. When bridges collapsed, roads deteriorated, or railways wore out, repairs would occur only if the infrastructure served German interests. Infrastructure serving local populations would be neglected. This infrastructure neglect would compound economic decline. Without functional transport systems, local economies would fragment. Agricultural products couldn't reach markets efficiently. What industrial production continued would struggle with supply chain disruptions. The economic integration that characterizes developed economies would break down. Germany, by contrast, would invest heavily in infrastructure within the Reich. The planned Autobahn system would be completed. Railways would be electrified and expanded. New ports would be built to handle trade from occupied territories. German cities would be reconstructed according to Albert Speer's monumental architectural plans. This infrastructure disparity would entrench German dominance. Even if political circumstances changed, the infrastructure advantage would give Germany continuing economic superiority. Occupied territories would lack the infrastructure necessary for independent economic development, making them permanently dependent on Germany. Telecommunications infrastructure would be tightly controlled. Telephone and telegraph systems in occupied territories would be monitored by German security services. This would prevent coordination of economic activity that might threaten German control, while ensuring German authorities could coordinate extraction operations efficiently. Energy infrastructure provides another example of deliberate underdevelopment. Occupied territories would have minimal electrification. Power generation would be concentrated in Germany and industrial zones serving German interests. This would prevent occupied territories from developing energy-intensive industries that could support independence. Long-term economic sustainability. The fundamental question about the Nazi economic order is whether it could have been sustained over decades. The answer is almost certainly no, but the process of collapse would have taken years or decades and caused enormous human suffering. Nazi economic planning was riddled with contradictions. The ideology demanded exploitation and extraction that would undermine long-term productivity. The system required ongoing coercion and violence that diverted resources from productive investment. The elimination of market mechanisms would create inefficiencies that compounded over time. Agricultural productivity in occupied territories would decline under extraction policies. Soils would be exhausted without investment in fertilization and crop rotation. Farmers would lack incentive to maximize production when output was simply seized. Agricultural yields would fall, creating food shortages even in traditionally productive regions. Industrial capacity would decay without investment in maintenance and modernization. Machinery would wear out and not be replaced. Skilled workers would die or flee. Technical knowledge would be lost. Industrial output would decline even in sectors Germany wanted to maintain. The forced labor system would prove economically inefficient. Coerced workers are less productive than free workers with proper incentives. High mortality rates would require constantly recruiting new workers. Training costs would be wasted when workers died. The economic output from forced labor would be less than could be achieved with properly compensated free labor. German economic advantages would erode over time. The resource base of occupied territories would be depleted. Infrastructure would decay. The skilled labor force in occupied territories would be destroyed by Nazi policies. Eventually, Germany would be extracting from an increasingly impoverished and unproductive economic base. The absence of innovation would hurt long-term growth. Economic development requires innovation, and innovation requires education, research infrastructure, and incentives for creative work. Nazi policies would destroy all three. The education of occupied populations would be suppressed. Research would be limited to military applications controlled by German authorities. Incentives would be eliminated by extraction policies that seized any economic gains. Germany itself would suffer from these problems eventually. Innovation requires diverse perspectives and free exchange of ideas. Nazi ideological controls and suppression of dissent would stifle German innovation. The exile or murder of Jewish scientists and intellectuals during the war had already damaged German research capability. Continued ideological purges would compound this damage. International isolation would limit economic growth. If Britain remained independent, or if the United States was hostile, Germany would lack access to global markets and resources outside Europe. The European economic space, even under total German control, would be smaller and less dynamic than the global economy. German living standards would suffer from this isolation. Eventually, the economic contradictions would create crisis. Productivity declines would reduce available resources. German living standards would begin to decline. Internal discontent would grow. Occupied populations would resist more actively as they had nothing left to lose. The economic base supporting the Nazi state would crumble. Whether this collapse would take 10 years, 30 years, or 50 years is uncertain. Historical empires built on extraction rather than productive investment have sometimes persisted for generations before final collapse. The human cost during those generations would be immeasurable. Comparisons to historical economic exploitation. The Nazi economic order would have represented an extreme form of economic exploitation, but it had historical precedents that provide context for understanding its likely consequences. European colonial empires practiced economic extraction from colonized territories for centuries. Raw materials flowed from colonies to metropolitan centers. Manufacturing was prohibited or suppressed in colonies. Trade patterns were manipulated to benefit colonial powers. The results were underdevelopment, poverty, and economic distortion in colonized territories that persisted long after formal independence. The Nazi system would have been colonial exploitation applied to Europe itself, with the added dimension of racial ideology justifying even more extreme exploitation than occurred in traditional colonies. Where colonial powers sometimes invested in infrastructure or education in colonies for pragmatic reasons, Nazi ideology would preclude such investments in territories designated for eventual elimination. The Soviet economic system under Stalin provides another point of comparison. Soviet economic planning also created inefficiencies, relied on coerced labor, and extracted resources from peripheral regions to benefit the center. However, Soviet ideology at least nominally valued workers and proclaimed eventual equality. Nazi ideology explicitly valued different populations differently and planned permanent hierarchy. The Soviet system was brutal but theoretically temporary. The Nazi system planned permanent stratification. The plantation economies of the Americas based on enslaved labor offer perhaps the closest historical parallel. These systems extracted maximum labor from enslaved populations for the benefit of plantation owners and metropolitan centers. They created enormous wealth for beneficiaries while immiserating the enslaved. They persisted for centuries but ultimately proved unsustainable, collapsing through revolution or reform. The Nazi economic order would have combined the worst aspects of colonial exploitation, totalitarian planning, and slavery into a system of continental-scale economic extraction. Historical experience suggests such systems create short-term benefits for the exploiting group at the cost of long-term economic decline and eventual collapse. Conclusion. The economic consequences of a German victory in World War II would have been catastrophic for most of Europe. The Nazi economic order would have restructured the European economy along hierarchical lines designed to benefit Germany at the expense of everyone else. Resource extraction would have been systematic and comprehensive, reducing occupied territories to the status of colonies supplying raw materials to the German metropole. Industrial capacity in occupied territories would have been destroyed or subordinated to German control. Labor exploitation ranging from harsh working conditions to outright slavery would have powered the Nazi economy. Financial controls would have extracted wealth from occupied territories through currency manipulation and forced tribute payments. Trade patterns would have been restructured to create permanent dependencies. Living standards would have declined dramatically for occupied populations, while remaining artificially elevated for Germans through extraction. The system would have been unsustainable in the long term. Economic inefficiencies, resource depletion, infrastructure decay, and suppression of innovation would eventually undermine productivity across Europe. German living standards would ultimately decline along with the occupied territories they were exploiting. But sustainability over decades or centuries wasn't necessary for such a system to inflict enormous harm. Even 20 or 30 years of Nazi economic exploitation would have impoverished generations, destroyed industrial capacity that took decades to build, and set back economic development in occupied territories by half a century or more. The actual economic history of post-war Europe stands in stark contrast to this nightmare scenario. The Marshall Plan invested in European reconstruction. Market economies were established. International cooperation through institutions like the European Coal and Steel Community laid foundations for the European Union. The result was unprecedented economic growth and rising living standards across Western Europe. Understanding what the Nazi economic order would have meant reinforces the stakes of World War II. The conflict wasn't simply about military victory or political control. It was about whether Europe would develop as an integrated community of nations with market economies and rising prosperity, or be reorganized as a hierarchical extraction system designed to enrich one nation at the expense of all others. The economic documents and policies that Nazi Germany implemented during the war demonstrate that the exploitative system described here wasn't speculation. It was the Nazi plan, partially implemented and ready for full application under a victory scenario. That this plan was defeated represents an economic liberation as significant as the military and political liberation.